the Solidarity Fund, and the Indigenous Development Grants. And I'll just have Tamara and Jason introduce themselves to you first, and then we'll get talking about those programs. Tamara, if you can just start by introducing yourself and your involvement with the Solidarity Fund.
Sure. Thank you so much for including me in this call this afternoon. So my name is Tamara Dowett, and I'm one of the founding board members of the REMC, which is the Racial Equity Media Collective, and we're a national nonprofit organization which advocates for BIPOC creators in the screen-based industries here in Canada. And we've really been working with the team at the ISO over the last couple of months, as well as with BIPOC TV and film, on the development and criteria and shaping of this Solidarity Fund to make sure that it's really, I think, meeting the needs of the Black and people of color creators in response to their needs related to COVID.
Great, thank you. I also want to add that we have also partnered with the Producers Pledge, which is managed by Impact. They've added their funding to this program. And I also want to acknowledge the In Spirit Foundation, who has also contributed to the Solidarity Fund. And now, Jason, can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role in relation to the development grants?
Hi, Carrie. I'm Jason Ryle. I'm Anishinaabe from Lake St. Martin in Manitoba, based in Toronto, and I'm currently working with the ISO on a contract to help with the COVID-related emergency grants, specifically the Emergency Relief Fund for Productions, which is currently open, and the development grants, which we are talking about here today.
Great. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to share my screen and talk you through the development grant programs, and by that I mean Indigenous Development Grants and the Solidarity Fund. The two programs are very similar. There are only some slight variations in terms of the eligibility and the guidelines. So what we're going to do is go to the Indigenous Screen Office website, and we're going to walk through those guidelines and give you a sense of where to find everything and how to apply for the grant. So I'll share my screen now, and we'll go to the ISO website, which is iso-bea.ca. And once you get to the home page, you would go to the Access Funding Programs page, and there you can see all of the current ISO programs. So we do have another open program, that's Partnerships Fund, and here we have Indigenous Development Grants, and right below that, the Solidarity Fund. So we'll start with the Indigenous Development Grants and just walk through there. There's a click through for the application guidelines, and we always recommend that before you apply, you read all of the guidelines, top to bottom, and make sure that you are eligible. If you have a question about your eligibility, please contact us. Our website for both, our email for both programs, if you have questions, is right here. It's funding@iso-bea.ca. And here you can click through the application eligibility and guidelines for either individuals, so you can apply as an individual, or you can apply as a company. So we'll click through to individuals, and maybe Jason, you can just walk us through the guidelines for individuals.
Sure thing. So in both cases for individuals and companies in relation to the development grant, the deadline is from today, next week, Friday, October 16th. So there's still about 10 days for applications to be put through to the ISO. Also, I'll just reinforce what Carrie said about any questions that you have about the project, please contact us. We're here and available to answer all your questions. In regards to the individual applications to the development grant, again, like it is for companies, the program offers support for either project or career development, or any kind of combination of both of those for Indigenous screen content creators. You know, and the development grants, as anyone out there likely knows, there's been such a paucity of development support in the landscape for so long. When news of this grant was being developed, I mean, I personally was very excited because it really fills such a huge need and a huge void in our sector to support screen content creators in the development of their work. I think what's really fantastic, particularly about this grant, is that it really is quite broad in terms of how it looks at development. The key point here is that this grant does not support any component of production of your particular project. So anything that relates to the development of your project, or also specifically to your career, is eligible for support here. So if we're looking at the actual guideline document, which is on the screen now, the eligibility for this program is the individuals have to be a First Nations person, Inuit or Métis, residing in Canada. This is again, an opportunity for Indigenous screen content creators who are living in Canada, who are from Canada. And you can read the other items there in regards to working in the screen-based content, and some requirements in regards to the funding. Should we skip over companies, Carrie, or do you want me to go over that now?
No, you can go for that now, but I just also want to make a point here that that the fund is available to anyone working in a screen-based content format, and that includes TV, film, web, gaming, apps, and XR. So that's and this is one of the differences actually. So for the Solidarity Fund, it's a little more narrow. It was TV, film, XR, VR, AR. But for the Indigenous Fund, it's a little more broad in terms of what you can apply for, the type of creation. So that's just one of the key differences. And we really do want to encourage applicants who are working in non-traditional digital platforms to apply for development funding.
That's a really, really great point in referencing that. Most of the questions right now have been associated to TV and film, and certainly encourage anyone working in other screen-based sectors or mediums to get applications in, or any questions regarding that specifically. Also too, in regards to any of these particular forms of media, just a reminder too that career development, professional development is also an opportunity to apply for through this grant. So for example, if someone is quite interested in diversifying their practice or looking at getting into gaming, for example, this fund could potentially support that particular kind of development. In regards to companies, again, as you can see here, the applicant company must be majority Indigenous owned, which is 51%, and Indigenous from Canada is the key for this grant. And again, just some business items there in regards to the corporation head office in Canada. The bios for the owners must be provided in addition to their percentage ownership, and identifying their nation within or status within the country. And I think the rest is really kind of self-evident there. The last point, the main activity of the organization is the production or support of screen-based content. I think, again, this is another disparity or differential point between this grant and the Solidarity Fund, but Tamara and Carrie will get to that in a second. Moving on, eligible program activities. Again, these are sort of 4 components here that we've sort of categorized. And the intention here is like to really sort of capture, I think, a high level, a range of activities. So what we have here are research and script or project development for new works. And new works is really, I think, one of the key elements of this particular grant. Again, this is not intended to be a fund to support a project already in development, or rather already in production. But this is really something intended to support creators at the very kind of early stages or the outset of a particular project idea. We do point out here specifically too that this also includes cultural and community engagement work, which of course we all know is really vital and essential to the development of our stories on any kind of screen. So really that can broadly encompass so many different things within the context of research or project development. One of the things too, I think that is particularly exciting here is that second point, the development for translating into existing IP, intellectual property, into new screen-based works. So this also can include optioning for different types of work for you to translate or adapt it into different forms of media. And I think that, again, is something that's really quite rare within the funding landscape in terms of support on that front. And I think, you know, I just want to underscore, as you all know, I mean, really sort of allowing Indigenous producers, screen content creators to option work by other Indigenous artists in different media is so important, really, to keep those stories within Indigenous majority ownership. Likewise here in relation to the career professional development online courses, training program for skills career development in relation to the project is really essential. I suppose a quick example there could be if you know, you're a documentary filmmaker and you're looking to transition over to narrative, is there some type of course or sort of workshop or mentorship you'd like to be involved in to help you develop those skills? This program could assist. And the last point, again, speaks to really that important part of a cultural component within the development phase, a structured mentorship, again, here for cultural or professional development in relation to a project. So this could be shadowing, placement, mentorships opportunity. Again, the key word there is structured. It would have to have some shape that's described within the actual application itself. One of the questions we've been getting a lot about in terms of the feedback to date. Sorry, Carrie, did you have a question at that point? I was switching gears to eligible expenses. No. A lot of questions in regards to what are eligible expenses, and maybe whoever's listening has some specific questions too. So please, you can ask away after the conversation. But again, it's really quite broad. And what I love is that the first point here is fees and living expenses for project leads. And that's something I think we can't stress enough, how important it is for artists to ensure that they're paid, that they're compensated for the time and talent that they're giving to the development of this project. This is not a grant that's going to negatively scrutinize an artist paying themselves for their time. In fact, we really encourage you to really put, you know, that thought into how much time you're going to be giving to the development and how much that is going to cost you. So things like living expenses, which includes food, rent, anything like that, can be incorporated into those costs. Likewise, paying for any kind of consultant, expert fees for your project. We list there example story editors, mentors, advisors, contractors engaged for development work. This could include any one in cultural leadership roles, for example, elders or other knowledge keepers. The licensing of existing IP, again, which relates to my comment earlier about optioning costs, translation and language support. I mean, this includes, you know, French to English, English to Indigenous languages into English, whatever they may be. This can support that. Fees and honoraria for community engagement, consulting fees, facilitator fees, travel costs. This is, again, something that has cropped up as a question. I mean, if you really feel that travel costs are essential to your particular development, certainly put those in and include those within your budget and the scope of your project. I'd also advise, in terms of any travel costs, just put some context around it. I think anything additional that you could envision a jury, anything you can envision a jury may have questions about, I mean, try to answer those in advance. And I think something like, well, how contingent is this project on travel, for example, if there's still going to be travel restrictions throughout 2021. Technology costs, there's been some question about whether or not this includes equipment purchase. It does not. This includes things like equipment rentals, but does include things, for example, like the purchase of software membership. If you need, for example, Final Draft to write your script, this covers that type of activity. Or a Zoom membership, which we know is quite costly. This can cover Zoom membership, so you can have more than 40-minute long meetings and have the whole host of features in that regard. Fees for courses and training programs. I think, if you're doing something formal here, I'd advise that, you would include any kind of sort of description of the curricula that you're taking in and the cost of it into your application. Just again, to answer any questions the jury may have about sort of the structure or the length of time and cost of that particular fee. And the last one, admittedly is a bit of a catch-all, other associated project costs clearly identified with project development work. And look, really, that's just about saying here, we know that there's a breadth of activities and every project is different, and every artist, every applicant is going to have a different approach to these things. So if you really just frame it in a lens of development for your particular project or idea, or your own professional development, then really those things I think would be eligible for this grant. Certainly get in touch with me and we can discuss those if you have any questions. But I think it's a really sort of great framing here about what might be eligible. Carrie, did you have anything to add, or did I overlook anything?
No, I was just going to add that related to the cost of purchasing hardware, although that expense is not eligible, the living expense is, and so you could always, if you are able to, allocate some of your living expense fees towards the purchase of technology, that's fine. It's just not eligible within the larger budget. So just to say that. And Tamara, why don't we hop over to the Solidarity Fund guidelines, and just because they're so similar, we'll just maybe go over some of the differences between the two programs. There are only slight differences, and maybe Tamara, while I'm loading up the page, you can speak to the priorities for that program and the goals of that program.
Yeah, and I think that that's really the main thing that's maybe a little bit different and helps to sort of frame, why the Solidarity Fund is even existing. So I'll go over that part here, which is in the program guidelines under the heading of funding processes and priorities. So some of the big things here to be aware of is that these applications will go through a peer review process, and this will be by a peer review committee of racialized professionals from the screen-based community across Canada. And also, I think it's always helpful when you're starting to fill out an application to have an idea of how it's going to be scored and what that peer review committee will be looking at. So those key areas in terms of scoring will be, the strength of the project that you've applied for, whether it's you as your individual or you as your company with one or more projects. The viability of the project, is this something that the committee actually feels can be accomplished and can be done based on the plan you've put forward? And then the need and the impact. So it's always, important to articulate why you need to do this and what the result is that you're going to be expecting at the end of it. And to make sure that I think there's a strong relationship between both of those, so that the committee can understand the logic. And if you spend money on these three activities, this is the ultimate result that you're aiming for, and you have a strong plan in terms of how you're going to get there. So those are the things we'll be looking at in that regards of assessing those applications. We do have some core priorities, and this is where I guess there's again a bit of a difference from the other stream. So we are going to be prioritizing applications to make sure that there's strong representation from Black creators. We are also going to be looking to make sure that there's strong regional representation, so that we're not only, dispersing funding to applicants in Toronto or Vancouver or something like that. We want to make sure that people across Canada are applying and that we're able to disperse funding right across the country as well. We'll also be looking for the inclusion of diverse perspectives in the applications, of emerging voices, and as well for representation in both official languages in terms of the applicant companies and the languages that they're operating in, or the individuals. So I think for me, those are the sort of priorities that I think are important to flag. I think, Carrie, as you mentioned, maybe big difference is that we're only accepting TV, film, digital web, and XR, which is VR or AR applications, so not apps or gaming in the Solidarity Fund stream. And that on the company side, the total amount of money for a slate is $25,000, so it's just a little bit lower. And it's $15,000 for one single project coming in from an individual applicant. Are there any other big differences that I've missed?
Yes, there's just one other big difference, and that is for the Solidarity Fund. If you are a company who has received over $25,000 in COVID relief funding through CMF Telefilm or Canada Council, you are not eligible for this program. And that was just a decision of priorities. And we are seeing the demand for the Solidarity Fund is actually extremely high. We've been getting lots of questions. And so that priority was made to ensure that we can support as many people as possible who did not already receive support. It's different for the Indigenous Development Grant. In that program, everyone is eligible to apply, but priority is given to those who have not yet received funding. These are healthy, we have pretty healthy budgets for these funds, and we may be receiving additional funding. So please apply, even if you may not be a priority, if you're eligible, that is, please apply. And for this kind of program, even if we're not able to fund all of the projects, the amount of applications will give us leverage for our advocacy to ensure that we continue getting additional funds moving forward. And so it's really important that you apply if you have a project, and please just let us know if you have any questions in advance, but don't let the priorities stop you from applying, because we may have enough money to hopefully fund as many projects as possible. So I think, can you both see the chat? I'm wondering if we have any questions. Because I'm screen sharing, I can't actually see the chat. And I just want to make sure we answer any questions that we might have at this
I have a question I can pose to you. So there's two questions here. One is, how many applications do you accept for the individual stream? So maybe that's how many applications do we think we might fund? Because I mean, there's no cap on how many people can apply, right?
Yeah, so one application per person, if that's what they mean.
Yes, that's a good.
And for individuals, Jason, we have had this question of how many projects an individual can apply for. And I believe the answer is that they can apply for more. Is it more than one project as long as the maximum is 15,000?
Yeah, that's right. So going back to the development fund guidelines, I mean, the place where we left off was in regards to the grant amounts. And so individuals, sole proprietors, and companies are eligible up to $15,000 for a single project. And for individuals, yes, you're right. That means that they can apply for more than one project for development, but their maximum amount is $15,000. Companies are eligible to apply up to $30,000 for a slate of more than one project. So the higher amount is really only applicable to Indigenous majority-owned companies. Everyone else is a cap of $15,000. So while the guidelines say individuals and sole proprietors 15 for a single project, what it really should be saying is individuals, sole proprietors, and companies 15 for a single project, with a caveat that there's a cap for 15 for individuals or sole proprietors if they're applying for more than one.
I will say that we launched these programs really quickly. So the ISO launched 4 programs in about 8 weeks. So if there are gaps in some of these guidelines, that's why. But we have developed an FAQ to answer some of the questions that we were getting most frequently. So we can go through that. Tamara, was there another question?
There's a bunch of questions. So if you want, I can keep.
Oh yeah, let's just, why don't we, I can come out of screen sharing and we can start answering some of those questions. and see how we go for time. And if we have time, we can go through the FAQ. But for everyone listening, there's also an FAQ for both programs. It's actually designed to address frequently asked questions for both of the programs. So please also visit that if your question isn't answered this session. But yes, Tamara, I think you're on it more quickly than I can, so please go ahead with
Actually,
the next question.
before we jump to a question, I just would like to underscore, Carrie, that we're also available for any questions. Like there have been a lot of emails we've received that have been apologetic about asking a single question. There's no apology necessary. Our time is here to answer your questions, so please, anything and anytime, send us questions.
Good point. We're here, that's what we're here for. So please don't be shy. And like I said, because these were launched so quickly, we know there are gaps in what we've said, and there's some information missing. So please don't be shy. So what's the next question?
Great. So the next question: are full-time students allowed to apply?
Yes, full-time students are allowed to apply, but your project cannot be your student project. So it cannot be the project you're applying for credit for, or for your, for your final group project or for class project.
Great. The next question: could funds be used to help launch a production company?
The funds are not for development, company development. They're for project development. So I would say,
there might be,
question, right?
It's a good question, because again, here I think where there might be, I agree, it doesn't, fund for, paying for things like the registration fee or whatnot, but because there's a career development component, I think, in terms of sort of if someone was to look for some professional guidance in terms of finding a structure, how to navigate sort of setting up a company, I think there's potential there. Again, all of these are going to a jury, so ultimately it's the jury's component to decide. But maybe that person who asked that question about launching a production company can provide a bit more detail. Like, are you thinking in terms of like developing, establishing, paying for the registration, and then marketing that company? In which case, maybe not. But in terms of sort of getting the knowledge in terms of how to set up a production company, paying someone a fee to guide you in understanding the different types of structures, I would say something like that would be eligible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Great. So please maybe get in touch with us on that one. And it sounds like we need to have a chat and get a little more information.
Okay. So the next one here is, do the projects with which the applicants apply have to be related to experiences as racialized individuals? So maybe this is one I can answer, at least in regards to the Solidarity Fund. I mean, I think the intent is really that the ownership of the project and the creative control of the project sits within the racialized communities, but there's no requirement for the project topic to have anything to do with your lived experience or your the diaspora community you come from, or anything to do with that. It could be a project about your pet. It could be a project about the environment. It's really about the ownership and the creative control.
That's the same for the development fund. I mean, keep in mind that these are going to a jury of Indigenous peers within the industry and sector. And they're going to be seeing a variety of story ideas and project ideas. So I mean, this particular grant is not based on that either. It's really artist focused.
Great. Next question. May one person apply as an individual and within a company?
Yes, we've had this question from a few people, and the answer is yes. So you can apply as an individual and be affiliated with a project through a company that you're not the owner of. So in this case, if you're the story editor for a company or you're an employee with the company, that's fine, as long as you're not the owner applying as an individual.
Yeah, and again, that really is intended to sort of this idea of share the wealth, share the pot a little bit further. And that also extends to collectives, for example. If you're an individual artist, you're eligible to apply. The collective you're a member of, you're also eligible to apply. for a different project.
If it's really competitive, the jury will always kind of look at that and take that into consideration, along with the other priorities of regional representation and diverse representation. But yes, you would be eligible, so we would not discourage you from applying in that case.
Okay, that's it on the questions that I'm seeing here.
Oh, great. So we can go to the FAQs in the, I'm going to go back to the shared screen function. If there are more questions, just, you guys can just let me know. And let's see. If we go to the FAQs, these are some of the questions. And again, looking at the application page, I just wanted to point out something to be aware of before you apply, which is this link will take you to the application form. But before that, keep in mind that there are some downloadable documents that you want to download and fill out, and then they get uploaded into the application. So the application form just has the basic questions, address, applicant info. The questionnaire with the actual application questions about your project is here. You download that first, fill it out, and then attach it to your project. Same with the signed attestation, the budget, and you will also need to actually upload your bio or CV. That's missing here, but it's in the form. So I'll just go to the FAQs.
I've got some other questions coming in.
Oh, great. Let's answer them.
Sweet.
So the first one, is it only incorporated companies who can apply for the company grant, or an individual company as well?
Yes, so the individual, if you are a sole proprietorship, so you're registered as a sole proprietor, that's different from an incorporated corporation. So you are eligible to apply as an individual. We had a lot of back and forth and thinking around this, and so this is where we landed with individuals, because I know a lot of sole proprietors want the checks or the deposit made to the account of their business, but it's still an individual business. And so in that case, we can do that as long as you apply under that business name. If you're, does that make sense?
Yes, and so for the development grant, then if you're a sole proprietor, we just ask that you use the individual application form as opposed to the company application form.
Exactly, and you're eligible for 15,000 in that case.
And also, I'll just add to everyone listening in too, that, you know, this grant, if there's anything missing or if something isn't 100% clear, we're going to follow up with you before it really gets to a jury. So this isn't a case where perhaps if an element is missing, that's necessarily going to penalize you before it goes to the jury. We'll just work to try to make sure that all the elements are in place before it goes to that point.
I also want to say too, from the point of view of the ISO, we're just getting started in creating these new funding programs. If you have feedback about something like this kind of criteria, please don't hesitate to send us an email and let us know how this is working for you, and if it's not working, what any barriers are to you succeeding in your work or applying for our funding. We're very, very responsive to community, and that, that's really vital to what we do. So please don't hesitate to give us feedback on our programs and the guidelines. And we'll continue to address those as we move forward with new programs. Right.
I'll add to here, Carrie, again, just to reiterate what you said earlier about sort of how quickly these grants really came along. And I think that's, wonderful, hats off to the ISO for really sort of responding so quickly. And I think in really such a supportive way. But I'll also mention too that for the development grants, There is application assistance available for those who need it. We have based it on the Canada Council's application assistance program. So you can contact us or look up the Canada Council application assistance, and it's similar in scope and scale. But that thing, for example, can provide set stipends to a support person that you identify to help you with, for example, the framing of a concept or idea, transcribing your idea into written English, translation from any other language into written English, or translation from sign language into English as well. So if you have any questions in regards to application assistance, drop us a line.
We also have French language application form, and you can apply in French. And were there some more questions?
There's a lot of them again now.
Oh, amazing.
Maybe one of you can give some clarity around the attestation form and what that's about and what it's for.
Yes, I can tell you about that. It's specifically related to the federal government's mandate around COVID funding. So the ISO received this funding through the emergency COVID relief funding that came from the federal government, and it flowed through the Canada Media Fund. And we were able to receive a $3.3 million allocation. And so that was really around workforce recovery and business continuity, because the Indigenous screen sector is a burgeoning sector. We put the case forward that business continuity relied on the development of new content, same as with the Solidarity Fund. But we had, as part of that process, we're required to have the applicant sign an attestation form, basically saying that they're not double dipping. So you're not getting a number of different COVID relief funding for the same thing. And so that's really what that is attesting to. You can apply for development funding if you received CERB or whatever the new employee relief programs look like, as long as it's not for for the activities that you're putting in your budget for these projects.
I will add too that I think because these grants were really designed to be a quick response to need during the pandemic, it's also an attestation that what is being submitted is indeed valid. I think, as anyone has seen, the final reporting requirement for the development grant is a one-page update. So really the scrutiny for your project and your application is being done upfront, as opposed to in a final reporting stage.
Can we talk a bit, I guess, about the process after people apply? Because we have some questions around how long the review process will take and when we'll be announcing decisions.
So after we receive all of the funding, we look at the applications and we choose our juries from there, so that we're looking at people to sit on our jury who have not submitted grants. So there's a process of determining who we might ask to sit on the jury. And for us, the Solidarity Fund will be working with our partners at BIPOC TV and Film and REMC to select the participants, and ISO will select the Indigenous jury. That usually takes a couple of weeks. Then we give the jury a couple of weeks to read all of the applications, and it depends on the volume, how much time they need. So all of this will depend on the number of applications we receive. But we're looking at a late November jury, and which will give us probably early December for notifications, early to mid-December notifications. So that's a rough estimate. Again, volume will really determine how quickly we can process administrate the whole process, but we do work very hard to get those answers out to people as soon as we can.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty quick turnaround compared to, I think, council juries. And again, here, I think at the very least, everyone can expect to know before Christmas, before any kind of break happens at that point.
Okay, I think we have two more at least we haven't covered. So one is one application per project or all listed in one application?
So for the development grant, I mean, we're asking for one application for everything. So if you're submitting for, if you're a company, for example, submitting for a slate, your particular application form will have very specific sections that are asking for. If you're an individual, again, in the actual application form itself, the component that you're writing, we just ask that you break up your writing segments for each of them. So rather than two different documents, you can just write about project A, project B within a particular question. Likewise with the budget, one budget's fine with a grand total, totaling 15 or 30, whatever you're going for. But within the budget itself, you can just break out which components are for which project. No need to do multiple applications.
Okay, and there's another question here about COVID from someone asking, I guess, how much they have to prove that COVID has affected their ability to develop the project they're applying for funding for.
You don't have to for this. It's really on the strength of the project. You don't have to prove.
Yeah, and again, this is where the attestation form really comes in, and like Carrie said, it's just, you know, the going concern here is that there's no duplication of expenses from COVID sources from levels of government. So if you're a film production, for example, and you've identified $50,000 in direct expenses that have risen because of the pandemic, either up to this point or coming up, and you've received 20,000 from other sources, then you would only be eligible to apply to the ISO for 30 of that if you were applying for the emergency relief fund, for example, or to the development grant. If you received X components from other sources and you're committing 20,000 of that to a $50,000 ask, then that would affect what you're able to ask the ISO for.
I'll just add to that. So for the development fund, we're really operating on the assumption that everyone has been impacted. And so that's our baseline. And we're really looking to support the entire sector. And by that, I mean the Indigenous sector and racialized creators within the sector to continue developing content at this time. So continue to be able to support themselves in their creation of that content and to ensure that we have a sector that has Indigenous and racialized people in it when this is over, because we recognize that often you know, Indigenous and racialized creators are already working with limited means and limited opportunities to access large financial support for their projects. And so we want to ensure that when this is over, we have a vibrant sector that represents the Canadian population as we know it.
So we have two other questions here, and I think maybe it would just be helpful to sort of double back and clarify that these are funds for projects in development versus funds in active production, because these questions here, one is, you know, in the case 100% of the ISO funds are being used for extra COVID costs for shooting on the production, so it's not money for something in active production. And I'll read you the other question before one of you can respond. If you've received funds for the COVID funds to apply to an active production, would it negatively impact your chances to receive the development fund? So I think these are both from individuals with projects in active production that have somehow been halted or have new costs because of COVID. And they're potentially looking for money to help out with those things, which is a little bit outside of our scope here.
It would appear to me that I think maybe perhaps the person who's asking this question has received funding from the Emergency Relief Fund for productions, the other ISO grant that is still currently available, just FYI for anyone out there. So here again, as was mentioned earlier, you're certainly eligible and encouraged to apply for the development funds if you've received, even if you've received emergency relief fund for productions. Again, the jury will be instructed to give priority to those projects that haven't yet received, to those individuals or companies that haven't yet benefited from any COVID funding at this point. But again, there may be some new money coming this way, so it may be possible to fund more than we anticipated. And again, that stipulation of the priority to focus on projects or individuals that haven't received funding yet is an effort to really share the wealth and the limited amounts in this pot of money. So certainly I'd encourage that person to absolutely apply to the development fund all the same.
Yeah, I agree.
And again, I don't know if there's another sort of, I think that the second question there may be, I wonder if it's the same person who asked that question. So for the development funds, for the development grants, you don't need to show any other financial support. The ISO development grant could fund 100% of your project for the development fund, which was not necessarily the case for the emergency relief fund for productions.
I'll just add as well. Oh, sorry.
No, that's questions right now. I'll keep checking.
I was just going to add that a lot of the design of the ISO's programs, the 4 different programs, was in response to the way that the COVID funding was delivered, which was primarily to support those who already had companies that were being funded by the major funders. And so this is an opportunity to, yes, still support those companies who are often funded at the lower levels, even within the larger institutions, but also to ensure that there's a mechanism to support individuals and companies that are not in that funding system, that do not already have support, and to make sure that we offer that support. And so we're trying to serve those 2 functions, which is why the program was designed with those priorities in mind.
And it's interesting, Carrie, you know, some of the questions that we've been getting, I mean, I think because, you know, there's been such a lack of development specific funding across the sectors for so long, I think it's taking a bit of reframing about how to apply for a development grant. And like really, again, you know, there's clear objectives, like, you know, you want to apply for development support to come out of it with a full-length feature film script, for example. But it could also be really earlier than that, as we said, with anything related to career or cultural development. Say, for example, you really want to spend time with your community, with your nation, to understand how your own cultural or national protocols will impact or affect or shape your own creative development. I mean, that's something really that this fund could support as well.
And for those of you who are Indigenous and may not have projects ready, I want to also, for you to keep in mind that we will have our Netflix funding program coming out soon. That one had been primarily focused on onset production mentorships, but there's also a cultural mentorship component to that program, for which you can apply for pre-development. So just exactly the kinds of activities that Jason was just talking about at the pre-development phase, connecting with elders, connecting with knowledge keepers, language speakers for your project. So we'll be announcing the new deadline for Netflix in November. We've just been kind of waiting to see what is happening with productions, but we'll be announcing that soon, and it's likely to be a January deadline. So keep that in mind as well. Any other questions?
I've got one last question here, which we may not be the best people to answer, but maybe we can give some insight. And this is around how much money should an applicant with, I guess, a successful project be putting aside for their taxes?
Yeah, that's something that we can't really provide details on. I mean, taxation levels are based on, you know, an individual or a company's income, the province they're in, and whatnot. So I'd advise maybe to seek some guidance from someone who perhaps is more established in your area, or a provincial or municipal arts council also can provide some assistance in that regard. Carrie, do you have any?
Well, I know as a rule of thumb, when I'm self-employed or have been self-employed for many years, and as a rule of thumb, I usually set aside 20%, and that has served me well. But like Jason said, it depends on your income and your write-offs and all of that, so it's hard to say.
So yes, good guideline, but definitely I think, check it out with some official within your region.
Always best to set aside more than less is better.
And I just go back again.
Bill.
Yeah. In terms of some of the questions that we've been getting to in the funding email have to do with budget, and really sort of like, how do we show things in the budget? I think, again, imagine always that you're not just writing for a jury of your peers, but you're preparing the budget for them too. So we don't need to see things like quote estimates from different companies or organizations, nothing to that degree. We're still very much looking for high level, but some detail within that high level. So I think, for example, like if you're showing living expenses and a dollar amount, I think, a jury always likes to see a little bit more detail. Like, what are you estimating? How many days are you estimating you're going to be working on this project? And what amount are you assigning to that? It's not so much that that detail is going to be scrutinized, but the absence of it actually, I think, raises more questions than just putting a little bit more detail. I think answers and shows that you've really given some critical thought to the shape and the cost of your project. Also, too, within the budget, I think it's great to identify which fees you're expecting to pay to an external consultant and which fees are going to you as the applicant lead or the company lead. I think that's always good for a jury to consider. But again, there too, the more detail you provide, always welcome. But we don't need to see things like external quotes or estimates on costs.
Right. Another good rule of thumb is to always make sure that anything in your budget is explained in your narrative. So, there shouldn't be anything in your budget that wasn't identified as part of your plan, as part of your process, that a jury would say, oh, what is that weird expense and where's that coming from? So your narrative and your budget should match up.
So I think one of the things too that's interesting, I mean, speaking specifically, I think about perhaps documentary projects, in the development phase, it's not uncommon for documentaries in development to shoot some existing footage that may or may not end up in the final production. Something like that, if something is really time sensitive and essential to the development of your project, for example, shooting an event that only happens once a year, then those costs could be included in a development phase project. Again, it's really important, like Carrie said, to frame that within the written component of your application.
Great. Any more questions? We've got about 5 minutes left. So what I can do is quickly walk through some of those FAQs. I think we've answered quite a few of them already. Like the first one is related to having already received some support through the funders. You are eligible, again, except for that specific case with the Solidarity Fund, if you've received more than 25,000. Another thing we also say at the ISO is that you have to be in good standing, so you can't have an overdue final report. So what that means is if you've completed your project and it has been more than 3 months since your project completion date, which was put on your application, then your final report is overdue. And you may be withdrawn from the program if you apply without submitting that final report first. If you have, for example, received a Netflix grant in the last round and you're still working on your project, then your final report is not overdue and you're eligible to apply. That's fine. So we have received a few questions along those lines, and that's the general overriding principle for all ISO grants.
Carrie, there's a question that popped up here, perhaps, that we could just turn to, because I think it's going to be relevant to maybe some of the questions that you're
Okay, sure.
reading off here. And it says, for clarity's sake, could you specify whether or not an individual can apply as part of a collective for 15,000 and have a separate individual application for 15,000 for the Solidarity Fund?
So we had said that yes, you can. You will have to consider how that might affect the priority that a jury would give. So we're not saying it's not eligible. You can apply for both.
And
oh no, sorry, collectives are not eligible, are they? You have to be a company.
I mean, I guess it depends on how we're interpreting what this person means by a collective. Like if I'm, I don't know, a story editor or an editor or a designer working on someone else's project who's applied, but can I also apply for my own?
Yes. So sorry, my mistake. We do not have a category for collectives in this fund. You have to apply, and again, it's for tax reasons and because of the sort of the rules surrounding the COVID funding from the federal government. So you have to apply as an individual and take responsibility for that grant. You're able to apply once. You can apply if a company can apply if you're associated with this company as a non-owner. But if there's a collective, a non-incorporated group of people who just want to apply as a non-incorporated group, an individual is going to have to apply as the applicant and take responsibility for that grant and be the person with the tax implications for the grant.
That's also true for the development grants as well, in
Yes.
case anyone listening is wondering about that.
Yes. So my apologies about that. I answered incorrectly. Collectives are not eligible for this particular grant.
Also, too, one of the things I think we're gonna come to as a question that we haven't mentioned yet is that applicants must choose, if they're eligible for both the Solidarity Fund and the development grant, you must choose one, even if it's different projects.
And again, we are limited in the amount of funding that we have, so we're just trying to ensure fairness and giving as many people as possible the opportunity to gain access to this funding. And I think we've got 1 minute left. Is there one question left, or is that it? All right, then that's perfect timing. Again, you can find all of this information at iso-bea.ca, and you are welcome to email us at any time before the deadline day on at funding@iso-bea.ca. Thank you, Tamara, and thank you, Jason, for doing this with us and sharing this information with everyone. I think it's been really valuable. Thank you. Bye, everyone.